Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Mention offer code TRADITION for a special Christmas offer. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
These year in review kind of videos sometimes can be interesting, depending on what you're interested in watching and how they're presented. And oftentimes people will just list off the, biggest movie failures of a year, biggest sports moments of a year, the biggest political moments, whatever. I'm not going to do that with this year in review for 2024. Instead, I'm going to paint for you a picture of what was done to the church in 2024 using the biggest stories that I think didn't get enough attention, or the biggest stories that, when you put them together, really kind of show you what's actually going on and what to expect in 2025. These are things that I hope you'll take with you to Mass today for your prayers. And I say Mass today because it is at least in the United States, it is a holy day of obligation. Hence why there's a educational video instead of a news video today. It is, depending on which calendar you're using, a solemnity for the Virgin Mary and the Novus Ordo, kind of a generic, similar kind of thing on the 1962 liturgical calendar, or for the pre-55 calendar, which kind of opened the door for the change to the new Mass anyway. When they changed Holy Week, they also got rid of what they called superfluous feast days. These were like, St. Peter had like 3 feast days and all this other stuff, and they did away with a lot of them, and one of them was today's feast, the Feast of the Circumcision, which is sort of a preview of the Passion of our Lord, the first time his blood was spilled, all the rest of it. So, point being, it is a holy day of obligation. Go to Mass today and maybe pray for everybody you're about to hear in this video today. Let me know if you're outside the United States, if you had a holy day of obligation today too, because I don't generally keep up with holy days of obligation that don't affect me personally. So sorry if that's selfish. But the key takeaway for 2024 is this. There's been a concerted effort to bury the Catholic Church and replace it with something new, something that looks like Catholicism on a surface level, but it is clearly preaching a different gospel than the Catholic Church has always preached. They call this synodality. The people who have been promoting it sometimes call it the new synodal church. They keep using the language of a new religion. They have said in the run-up to 2024, in the earlier stages of the synod, that the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass that developed organically from at least as early as the 5th century, and really when you dig into it, all the way back to apostolic times, that organically developed not just into the 16th century, but after all the way to 1962, that the ecclesiology, meaning the theology of what the church is and its mission in the world, the theology represented of ecclesiology in the traditional Latin Mass is not compatible with the new synodal church and the church after Vatican II, a tacit admission of everything traditionalists said, that they have been trying to impose a new religion for decades, and now they're really doubling down on this. And to dovetail with that has been something else Francis has always said, that he was made Pope to finish the implementation of Vatican II. Look, this is what we're going to talk about here today for the 2024 year in review. A key idea behind this is the concept of the Synod of Synodality being seen as being about process, changing the processes decisions are made in the church, changing the power dynamics of things. In fact, the entire governance of the church, when they spoke about how decisions were made, it looked like something like how Karl Marx would suggest the Catholic Church should be run, because they talked about things in terms of power dynamics, as opposed to the salvation of souls, which is how Catholics always spoke about these things. We have seen this with Cardinal Hollerich, the Relator General of the Synod on Synodality, as well as his co-chair, Cardinal Mario Gresh, and Francis and others continuing to demonize the Catholic Church as historically being insufficiently concerned with the laity. And so we go to the first story that kind of helps you understand this. It came from Vatican News, the BBC, basically, of the Vatican, with the headline, Cardinal Hollerich on Synod, Catholics will see a church where they count. Where they count. That's a fascinating framing. The idea that that the laity don't matter in the Catholic Church is, of course, nonsense. The entire mission of the church, its principal mission, the first law of the church is the salvation of souls. The church is very concerned with the laity, but it's concerned about the most important thing, your eternal destiny. At least the institution was until a few decades ago, when all of a sudden it became partners with the world, which is weird and has led to this crisis we have now. But in this article, Hollerich emphasizes that the synod was about process and inclusion. And yes, it was about change. But that change that everybody seems to want, except for those of us who just want old-fashioned Catholicism, that change would come as a result of processes being changed. Here he emphasizes that on matters of doctrine, morals, and even hinting that dogma will be included in this, that the voice of the laity will count in determining what the church teaches, what's important in its work, and what's not. That process is important. If you change who is involved in the process of decision making, you change what that organization does. It's true for any organization. The logic of secular, like student governments from colleges, that's where I used to hear this stuff decades ago, is now in the Catholic Church. It's amazing to watch, but that's what they've done. And here's just a little snippet from this article. Quote, Cardinal Hollerich says, the laity will probably not see a change immediately because changes need time. And the Holy Spirit needs time because he has to convert our hearts. That normally takes time because we put resistance. But they will see with time a church where they count, where they, the laity, are important, where their talents, their gifts, their life experience, there's your hint that this is modernism, are important because they belong to the people of the baptized. They belong to the holy people of God, and by their baptism and confirmation, they have received a mission. And this mission, we fulfill it together as a church, local, community, small community, parish, diocese, and beyond. End quote. This is the laity being involved in decision-making processes. The worst catechized generation in the history of the church, only one that came close to being as bad as we living Catholics today is the generation that came before us. And that's not to demonize anybody. We've all had to learn the faith because for some reason our shepherds refused to teach us the unadulterated faith. And this was absolutely done by design. The mission, he says, is we fulfill it together as church. Well, what's the mission? Well, synodality. Francis recently spoke about how fraternity is the vision of the church going into the future. It's an earthly, materialist, false gospel. That is what they're doing. You see, this is an extension of Vatican II's distortion of the concept of the priesthood of all believers, and it is an essential step to destroying the hierarchical nature of the church. So, if you don't believe me, you can maybe take what Father Gerald Murray had to say about this in an article that was published in many places, but the one I found first was in New Daily Compass, which is a European news outlet, with this headline, "The sheep in place of shepherds, the synod subverts the church." The synod has been distorted with its opening to non-bishop members. In the new synodal church, it is the people who instruct the bishops on the meaning of the faith. This is the liberal project announced by Cardinal Henry Newman with grave danger for souls. That's what Father Gerald Murray talks about. Here, Father Murray suggests that this was done not by Francis's instruction, but by those who run the Vatican Forum. This was published before the end of the synod, which is why this is, in hindsight, not the most accurate explanation for things, but Father Murray here says that essentially Francis's authority had been usurped. But his point here is interesting as well, because he is absolutely right about something here, and that this is a destruction of the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church itself. That is part of the point of synodality. Quote, "The episcopal and hierarchical nature of the Synod of Bishops effectively came to an end with the publication on April 26, 2023 of an unsigned document from the press office of the General Secretary of the Synod that announced the extension of participation in the Synodal Assembly to non-bishop members. They did this in 2023 before the first round of the meetings of bishops in Rome, which happened that fall in October. The document states that, quote, on 17th April 2023, the Holy Father approved the extension of participation in the Synodal Assembly to non-bishops. There's no citation of a papal decree dated 17th of April 2023 enacting this change of law, and I'm not aware that of such a decree has been published. Canon 51 states, quote, a decree is to be issued in writing. The reference in the document to a papal approval of change to existing canonical provisions is not sufficient to establish legal certainty in this matter. I note also the press office of General Secretary of the Synod does not possess the canonical authority to derogate from either the canons of the Code of Canon Law nor the Apostolic Constitution in this matter, etc., etc., etc. In other words, there is no written proof that this ever happened. But that doesn't matter because just a few months later, Francis was sitting at a table with laymen and bishops and cardinals, all speaking about the issues they think are most important to explaining the state of the church right now as co-equals, and an utter distortion of the actual hierarchical nature of the church. The linchpin for this is the papacy, what they want to do to the church. Papal primacy is in the way of everything they want to make happen, because everything they're doing right now could be undone with a stroke of a pen of a future Catholic pontiff. A pontiff who comes in and no one questions his elevation of the papacy. No one questions his orthodoxy. No one questions that he's actually Catholic or not. It could all be done with a stroke of a pen in a single document by a future pope. And that has to be prevented from happening, which is why on June 13th of 2024, the Vatican issued this a document called The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in Ecumenical Dialogues and Responses to the Encyclical Ut Unum Sint. The encyclical Ut Unum Sint is an encyclical from John Paul II in the 1990s that had actually been criticized when it came out by traditionalists for watering down the papacy in light of Vatican II and its spirit. But this document here that Francis had issued, which wasn't really him, it was a study document. It really does provide the roadmap for what the modernists intend to do to the church. We go to Vatican News again, because you will get a lot of admissions from them in their own from their own media. So you go to Vatican News for this headline: Rethinking Primacy in an Ecumenical Sense, a reflection on the study document, The Bishop of Rome, the Role of the Pope, Synodality, and the Other Churches. And it's by Andrea Tornielli. If you're not familiar with Andrea Tornielli, well, he is essentially a bit like the Baghdad Bob of Vatican City. He is a propagandist for all things Francis. I don't cover him very often just because he doesn't say things that are that interesting, because he will often say things that are actually not as, we'll say, revealing as, say, James Martin will say, or as the American Catholic Bergoglian press will say. But he is the chief propagandist in Rome for this. And here's what he has to tell us. He says, it's a history of a common path and centuries of unity, but also schisms, mutual excommunications, divisions, and struggles, determined more by politics than by theological differences. For almost 2 millennia of Christian history, despite old and new crises within the different confessions, the ecumenical journey is taking significant steps. The newly published document, The Bishop of Rome, attests to how the willingness and openness to discuss the forms of exercising the Petrine primacy manifested in 1995 by John Paul II has not remained a dead letter. Meaning the actual question of how the papacy is to be run is still open to discussion 2,000 years into the church's history. The dialogue has moved forward, and the synodal path that the Catholic Church is experiencing at every level as part of it. Indeed, Catholics are rediscovering and coming to a deeper understanding of the importance of synodality as a concrete way of living in communion in the church, an awareness already present and experienced by other Christian traditions. This is the Vatican giving endorsement to, as being valid, non-Catholic Christian organizations. Those of you who understand church history would find that appalling. At the same time, the role of the Bishop of Rome and his primacy are no longer considered by other Christians merely as an obstacle or a problem in the ecumenical journey. In fact, synodality always contemplates the presence of a protos, a primacy. Of course, for the other churches, Petrine primacy as exercised by the popes in the second millennium, and especially as sanctioned by the First Vatican Council, remains unacceptable. But on this issue too, the document of the Dicastery of the Promotion of Christian Unity shows significant steps. The work undertaken in the ecumenical dialogues has suggested a distinction between the papal primacy exercising jurisdiction over the Latin Church, or Western Church as Easterners like to call it, and the primacy and charity of the Church of Rome, the First See. A primacy of diaconia, that is, of service and not of power. A primacy of unity, exercised in synodality to seek the consensus of all the bishops. In other words, this is a reformatting of the papacy to sort of a first among equals, largely symbolic in nature, that of service and of charity, not of exercising papal power. And that sounds weird coming from Francis, who loves him some papal power. But the entire point is to change the church and make these changes irreversible, something Bergoglio's supporters in the episcopate, his biggest supporters among the College of Cardinals, going back a decade, said would be the end result of his papacy, that there would be no going back, that he would change the church and make it so they could not go back. That's the official Vatican line. I'll give you Vigano's response to it that he published a couple of months later. He's responding here, Archbishop Vigano, and we'll definitely be talking about him in a moment here in this year in review. Published this on X. He says the following, quote, "The synodal church distorts the papacy and the very nature of the Catholic Church, stating in words that it wants to democratize it, but in reality usurping that power that belongs only to our Lord Jesus Christ, in order to use it for the opposite purpose to that for which our Lord has established it. In the Bergoglian fiction, the Catholic papacy no longer exists, nor does the Roman Catholic Church. Instead, there is an ecumenical papacy and a new synodal church that carries out what Bergoglio and his accomplices impose with fraud and blackmail. The decision not to promulgate a post-synodal exhortation, we'll get to that in a moment, and to give magisterial value to a final document drawn up by lay people and non-Catholics serves to establish the permanent revolution, in which faith, morals, and the sacraments can be transformed, adapted to times and places, and are subject to the discretion of assembly bodies. The collegiality of Vatican II, which extended the prerogatives of the papacy to the bishops and episcopal conferences, is now extended with synodality to the entire ecclesial body and even to non-Catholics. The new syncretic church of humanity dreamed up of by the stonecutters and all the enemies of the Catholic Church in an anti-Catholic and anti-Christic key certainly subsists in the Bergoglian Church. Its ultimate goal is to oust Christ the King and High Priest, usurping his temporal and spiritual power. The grotesque exposition of the chair of St. Peter, which descends from Bernini's glory to follow Bergoglio, is in this sense emblematic, because it separates the symbol of Petrine power from its natural seat, in a literal sense, making it obvious for all to see that the chair is vacant. This is Archbishop Vigano just bluntly telling you he believes Francis is an anti-pope and not the pope. After all, he's saying there is no pope right now. Does not make him a sedevacantist. People, for some reason, get mad when I say that sedevacantists believe there hasn't been a pope since 1958. Vigano and others who hold a similar position believe there hasn't been a pope since 2013 or since 2022, late December 2022, when Benedict passed away, depending who you ask. But that is not sedevacantism. Sedevacantism is the belief there hasn't been a pope since 1958. This is a similar but a different position altogether. He continues saying the magisterium of the Bergoglian Church is no longer ex cathedra, but adversus cathedram, and is no longer from the chair, but against the chair. This should arouse dismay and scandal in those who, under the illusion of defending the papacy, are instead collaborating in its dissolution at the hands of a usurping tyrant against the will of our Lord and the ecclesial body. Open society and open church, two sides of the one coin of the worldwide integrationists' dictatorship. It's not surprising that the Jubilee 2025 advertising gadget, rightly presented with the emphasis reserved for the launch of a commercial product, presents disturbing similarities, if only chromatic, with the icon of the thermometer problem and how fake it is, Lady Greta. The light brought by the new synodal church does not recall Christ, the only light of the world, but rather the torch of Lucifer's rebellion. He doesn't mince words there, to put it mildly. As for the synod, instead of Francis doing what he always does, which is to take the synod's final document and issue his own, more moderate-looking document that hides its real aims behind ambiguous language and very troublesome footnotes, see Amoris Laetitia, for example, Francis endorsed the synod's final document calling for laity to be involved in the national bishops' conferences, diocesan decision-making, women having a greater role in the life of the church, and all the rest of it. He just endorsed it without changing anything. Shortly thereafter, we got this story. You see, on October 10th, 2024, Pope Francis met with American Cardinal Cupich, Tobin, and McElroy, who are as big as the loyalists in the church in America, where they reportedly talked about the state of the American hierarchy and the need to fill the many, many vacancies in the American hierarchy with new bishops who are more open-minded and synodal and ecumenical in their dealings. The story comes from the National Catholic Reporter, with a headline of, "This is likely what 3 U.S. cardinals discussed with Pope Francis." This was we'll call it a bragging article on their part. See, they met with him, and then they came back to the United States. The bishops did, these cardinals did, and started putting pressure on the bishops, especially at their Baltimore meeting in early November. That kind of got subsumed by the contest in November, that they needed to start implementing the recommendations of the Synod on Synodality, including the laity in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and all the rest of it. Thereafter, just a couple of weeks ago, we got wind of a new bishop in Tyler, Texas, who is a true blue Begolian himself. In his short letter to the laity upon taking office, he thanked Pope Francis for running the church the way that Francis is running the church, which says everything you need to know about him. Plus, he never one time acknowledged his predecessor, Bishop Strickland, publicly. He gave a press conference where he thanked the apostolic administrator who took over for Strickland. He talked about his own vision for things and talked to Pope Francis, but he never once talked about the elephant in the room, which was Bishop Strickland and what happened to him. Which brings me to the next important story, because they are trying to build a new church, and there's resistance to that. So what do you do to the resistance to that? To those who want to just keep Catholicism around, who want to keep the Catholic faith of the Catholic faith. What do you do with them? Well, you silence those voices as best you can. Numerous bishops and priests were canceled this year because they either admitted that they think Francis is a heretic and that his claims to the papacy are at best suspect, or because they simply spoke out against the new religion. This began in November 2023 in earnest, with first the canceling of Bishop Strickland, and then the attempt by Rome to take Cardinal Burke's apartment from him, with Cardinal Burke spending much of the early part of 2024 gathering the resources needed to keep an apartment. Though, as I understand it, he doesn't rent an apartment in Vatican City anymore. He actually rents one just outside of the walls in Rome. Let me know if I'm wrong on that, though. But his apartment, people think, oh, they're just taking his apartment away. You can go get a studio apartment and he'll be fine. That's not what his apartment was for. His apartment was more like an office with sleeping quarters and a place for him to offer mass. He had and still has several people directly employed by him. And the attempt to take a stipend away that he used to cover his apartment was an attempt to essentially take his employees away from him, his offices, and an attempt to silence him. Because Cardinal Burke has this habit of going to conferences, going on sometimes onto really high-profile podcasts, writing the occasional article where he will say things like, Francis is wrong for doing whatever it is the topic of the day. And he'll do it in a way that sounds very calm and peaceful in his delivery, and will sometimes not even mention Francis directly, but he'll say things like, there are apostates near the top of the church, things like that everybody knows what he was talking about. And so they tried to silence him. So we go to the National Catholic Reporter for this article that is very obviously bragging about this, with the headline, Pope Francis to remove Cardinal Burke's Vatican apartment and salary, sources say. This had its intended effect. Even though this process began before 2024 with Burke, the intended effect was to silence Burke and other bishops like him. In 2024, we saw something truly remarkable. The better bishops, those who published letters that speak publicly about Francis's errors, mostly went silent. The targeting of Cardinal Burke and Bishop Strickland before him was meant to send a message to those better bishops, and it was received very obviously, very loud and clear. And those who didn't receive it with Cardinal Burke's warning received it after May of 2024, when Archbishop Vigano was declared to have been excommunicated because he publicly said he doesn't believe Francis was ever validly named the Pope. And that had an odd reaction because Vigano's following is mostly among the laity. There was an odd reaction from the laity to that move by the Vatican. Many, many lay people who, when he hinted that he didn't believe Francis was the Pope, they agreed with him, who agreed that Francis is guilty of at least material heresy, and that there are some very serious questions about his validity and his claim to the papacy. From about 1,000 different ways you could question his claim to the papacy. And that weird reaction from the laity was, They left Vigano out in the cold. They ignored him because a man they say they believe to be a heretic declared Vigano to be excommunicated. That declaration came from Fernandez and Francis, when in reality, if Francis and his henchmen are heretics, then they don't have the authority to excommunicate anybody. And remember, the people who left Vigano in the cold on that largely agreed that the people who did that to him are heretics. It could have just been a excuse for many people because Vigano says some very spicy things. He takes some very unpopular positions, including on geopolitics. That leaves some people a little uncomfortable, to say the least. And that could be why they did it. They just took the odd opportunity, as well as rumors about Exsurge Domine and how they ordain people and all the rest. A lot of people just were like, you know what, maybe I should take this opportunity to step back away from Archbishop Vigano. Not everybody did, though, including myself. But what happened to Bishop Strickland in 2023, combined with Cardinal Burke and Vigano and numerous diocesan bishops in 2024, had a chilling effect. Many bishops stopped correcting Francis's errors entirely. That's just what they stopped doing. You may have noticed that I've had far fewer letters in 2024 from good bishops than I did in 2023, because a lot of them just stopped writing them entirely. And you see, along with that story, because of course you have to crush these, you have to actually crush the new religion, right? Or the new religion has to crush the old religion, rather. Along with that story, you had this. It was the ongoing decade-long story, at least decade-long. There are a few of these that happened under Benedict too, but it really took on a life of its own under Francis. It was the story of Rome canceling traditional women religious, or even religious orders deemed too conservative in the post-conciliar sense. Before the Arlington Carmelite story became something I talked about seemingly every other month on this channel, there was 2021, 2022, and in 2023, it seemed like every month I had a new story on some religious order somewhere in the United States, Europe, elsewhere sometimes, being canceled by Rome in a remarkably similar pattern. And they always took on traditionalists who were usually cloistered, meaning they spent most of their time praying and working behind closed doors, with very little contact with the public, or even just conservative Novus Ordo religious orders who still spend a lot of time doing distasteful things like praying. This took the form of a ruthless enforcement of a document called Cor Orans, the guiding document for religious orders that put traditionalist and conservative religious orders governed by the same named groups that are extremely progressive or for worse. If that doesn't make sense, let me give you an example. You would have, under these congresses, as they call them, you would have pantsuit wearing Benedictine nuns in the same Congress as traditionalist Benedictines. And they outnumbered, the pantsuit wearing ones, they outnumbered the traditionalist and conservative orders by large margins, and as a consequence, make rules for religious life for everybody in their Congress, binding on all of them. It's one way you crush tradition, is away from public eye, by forcing the traditionalist orders to become more post-conciliar, more synodal. Those orders who rejected this attempt on them suddenly got apostolic visitations from Rome, slanderous accusations against the character of the nuns and of their mother superiors, including accusations of impurity leveled against them. This has gone on for years around the world, and the local bishops are usually too happy to help Rome with this, because in so doing, they get the biggest prize of all. Very, very valuable land these convents and abbeys sit on. You might think, well, why do these dioceses care that much about money? Well, it's pretty obvious. Look at the Ted McCarrick problem. 20 years after that newspaper in Boston and the New York Times and a few others broke the story of the McCarrick issue, we'll call it, men unfit to be priests in the priesthood, 20 years later, they're still paying out for all those lawsuits. 20 years later. A lot of dioceses are bankrupt or had gone bankrupt or on the verge of it. So these convents can help solve their problem in a very big way. As a consequence, numerous groups in 2024 went independent or sought out the assistance and affiliation with the SSPX, or they just embraced completely sedevacantism. The highest profile story in America was the story of the Arlington Carmelite nuns, whose mother superior was accused of using illicit substances and engaging in violations of her vows with the priest. Later, investigations by the priest in question, or of the priest in question by his own bishop, found that he never did those things with the mother superior. and he was actually returned to active ministry in his home diocese, one that has a history of being cracking down rather hard on priests who violate their vows for frankly obvious reasons, thanks to Ted McCarrick. They returned him to active ministry, which puts the entire question into doubt, very serious doubt. He was returned to active ministry in his diocese, while the Mother Superior was attempted to be totally canceled by the Bishop of Dallas and the Vatican. And their ongoing story turned into November, where the Vatican declared that the nuns were no longer nuns and were living in the monastery illicitly. All that despite the fact that months earlier, the nuns in question allied themselves with the SSPX and started receiving the sacraments there. And all of that, while the Bishop of Dallas repeatedly said he wasn't interested in their property, despite numerous attempts to expel them from the property. Weirdly, the accusation that the Mother Superior was using illicit substances quietly disappeared from his accusations against her, and instead he focused on the alleged violations of her vows. Again, despite the story that the priest involved with the accusation the whole thing appears to have been nonsensical, because the priest in question was investigated by his own bishop and found to have not done anything at all. It's all very strange, and unfortunately, that story won't go away either. I expect in 2025 we'll see the next shoe drop on that, whatever form it takes. But that wasn't the only story like that, because this is a story that happens probably every month, most of the time well away from the public eye. The New York Times reported on this one with this headline: "These nuns were excommunicated but won't leave their convents. The Poor Clares of Belorado in northern Spain are digging in their heels in a battle of wills over real estate with the Catholic Church." This was Spain. The nuns here handled this one very differently. The New York Times gave this attention, which tells you just how big a deal this ongoing cancellation of nuns has become. The story is very similar to what was reported in Dallas, almost like there's a playbook being run against traditional religious. Essentially, the bishop, with the help from Rome, decided to make a play for very, very valuable property held by the nuns. In this case, instead of asking for help from, say, the SSPX or Veganos Exsurge Domine, which tends to have a bigger presence in Europe than it does in America, they instead went to a sedevacantist bishop for help. That is, in my mind, jumping the shark a bit. And unfortunately for the nuns, they found out quickly that the bishop they'd aligned themselves with was actually a grifter with invalid orders. Various sedevacantist outlets and websites tried warning the nuns against that bishop, but it was too late. And when they figured out that they'd made a mistake, they found themselves in a weird battle involving the secular authorities, leading the nuns to eventually finding a sedevacantist bishop who actually has valid orders and is actually Catholic to help them out. They were flying, it looked like, by the, pardon the turn of phrase, the seat of their pants here. But this is the effect that Bergoglians are having on the church, driving religious and bishops to take extreme measures to preserve the faith. All of this, by the way, while the secular world has decided to just openly embrace its devotion to Satan. We all saw the Olympics, the opening and closing ceremonies that were so overtly demonic that by itself woke a lot of people up to just how bad things are out there. Mockeries of the Last Supper. We saw in the political realm the high-profile future potential candidate who was also helping the loser in the last contest, mocking the Eucharist. The followers of Satan have been very open with what they're doing, while the church is convulsing, essentially, with this attempt to turn it into this new synodal church. And while that's happening, another thing happened. Fiducia Supplicans was issued about a year ago. It was issued as a result of the 2023 synodal process, the Synod Bishops meeting, where their final document for the 2023 session wanted more James Martin types included in things, and the church to come up with new language to talk about stuff and to basically normalize that sin. In response to that, Fernandez, the dicastery for the prefect for the dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, issued a document that authorized the blessings of their pairings and their relationships. The mental gymnastics that the Francis supporters did in 2024 to defend that document was astonishing. But what made it even funnier was that you could just look up in the document and find that it did literally endorse their pairings. It came to light in 2024 that a man now named a cardinal, about a month ago was named a cardinal, the papal preacher, had said about a decade ago that he found the activities, we'll say, of the James Martin crowd, the ones that cry out to heaven for vengeance or justice, depending on your translation, according to the scriptures, he called those activities Eucharistic. And when asked about it in late 2024, said he completely stands by what he said before. A number of men were named cardinals who appeared extraordinarily over the top, simplistic or sympathetic to the James Martin sin and those who wrestle with that sin. And by wrestle with it, I mean have given into it and think that the Catholic Church has always been wrong on that issue. We saw Cardinal Hollerich talk about how the church needs to come up with new language and a new way of addressing this and everything else, but not ever a call for repentance. Culminating, and it was announced in 2025, this year, September 2025, there will be a pilgrimage as part of the Jubilee Year of Mercy for the James Martin crowd. And we're not talking about those Catholics who have that inclination, but who resist it and live as Catholics should live. Those Catholics that I'm talking, those Catholics are a model for Catholics in how they carry their cross. They do it silently, usually. They don't get nearly the Catholic media attention they should. No, we're talking about the ones who want to change the church's teaching on it, who think the church is wrong on this issue and has always been wrong on that issue. They have a pilgrimage coming up in Rome with the full endorsement of the Vatican. The synodal church will have a James Martin face. That's the future of their ape of the church. An embracing of everything the world wants them to embrace, including sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance. Because at the end of the day, what is the infallible authority for this synodal church? The infallible authority is the secular world. Because their desire is to remain relevant. Their desire is to seek the approval of the secular world, to work with the secular world to build a better world, not the salvation of souls. That is what we have seen in 2024, unequivocally. And those who resisted were shut down or attempted to be shut down. My expectation for 2025 is more of the same, for as long as we have Francis. We will be wrapping this up, and I will wish all of you a happy New Year. Reminder again, today is a holy day of obligation. Please get to Mass and pray for everybody we spoke about in the chat today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.